Seches Megillah Daf Lamed Aleph begins right at the conclusion of the Mishnah. The Mishnah had listed the various different kriyos for the various different Yom Tovim of the year. Our Gemara quotes a lengthy brisa which describes more in detail those kriyos for the various Yom Tovim at the year. It also discusses the ones on Chalamod and on Shabbos Chalamod, which we didn't have in the Mishnah. The Gemara will interrupt the brisa along the way to mention what happens in our times in concise, where we have 2 days Yom Tov. What do you read on the second day of Yom Tov? We'll also have the Torah listed for each of them. Towards the end of the daf, the Gemara will introduce some Magadata, and it also discuss the reading during the weekdays of a regular week. So the brisa begins. On the first day of Pesach, we read from the list of the Yom Tovim in Parshas Emor, which is Shar Oy Kesev. The Gemara explains that that's on the second day as well. The first 2 days have the same kriya, Shar Oy Kesev. The Haftorah for the first day is Pesach Gilgal. That's the description of how they kept Pesach in Sefer Yeshua. And in the second day, the Haftorah is from Yeshayahu, where they kept Pesach over there. That's actually read in Sefer Malachim, but it's the Pesach of Yeshaya. Now, what do we read the rest of the days of Pesach? So the 4 days of Chalamayid, we read other times where we have Pesach described and mentioned in the Torah. Yomar says the simon is Ma'apu Mem Aleph Pei Vav, which stands for first Mishchu Kulchem Tzayin. That's the Mem. The Aleph is Im Kesef Talves Ami. The Fei is for Psolucha, that's after the Egel in Parshas Kisisa, and the fourth is Vayidaber, that's in Parshas Bahaloscha. So that's Mem Aleph Pei Vav. Now, on the seventh day of Pesach, which is the day of Kriyas Yam Sov, we read B'Shalach. We read about Kriyas Yam Sov. The Haftarah is Vayidaber David Lemachar. That is a shira, which is similar to the shira that's read in B'Shalach. It also speaks about Yetzias Mitzrayim to some extent, and the smoke that we had at the time over there, the column of smoke. Now, on the 8th day of Pesach, Shmish of Pesach, we read Kol HaBchar, which is again the Kriya of the Yom Tovim. This one is from Devarim, and the Maftir is Od Hayom, which is in Sefer Yeshaya, and the reason that we read that is because it discusses the fall of Sancheiriv and his attack, and that took place on Pesach night as well, so it's an appropriate reading for that time. Now, Abaye says the meaning today is different, and he gives a siman. He says we read Moshach Turo Kaddish B'Kaspa Psol B'Midbara Shalach Buchra. Pull the ox, bless the money statue in the desert, and send the Bechar. This is referring to the various different kriyas. They are the 8 days of Pesach. Mashach, of course, refers to Mishchu K'chulachem. Tura refers to Shor Oy Kesev. Kadesh refers to Kadesh Likol Bechor. Kaspa refers to Kesev Talves Ami. Psal refers to Psalacha, that's in Kisisa. Midbara refers to the kriya in Baaloscha. Shlach refers to that in Shlach. And Bechor refers to Kol Bechor. Now, the brisa continues. On Shavuos we read Shiva Shavuos Tisbarlach. That is the Kriya in Parshas Re'eh. That's Kol HaBachar. The Haftorah for Shavuos, the brisa says, is in Chavakuk. It's a Kriya in Chavakuk where it speaks about Matan Torah. It says Olaka Miteman Yavo, and that refers to Matan Torah, the storm wind approaching. Now, there's a machlokes here, the brisa says. There's others who say that we read Chodesh HaShlishi, which is the kriya of Matan Torah in Parshas Yisro. And the Haftorah should be Ma'aseh Merkava, the description of the vision of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Sefer Yecheskel, because of the revelation which took place on Shavuos. Says the Gemara, today that we have 2 days of Shavuos, we can read both of them, and we change the order. The first day we read what the Acherim had said. On the first day we read from Parshas Yisro, Matan Torah, and the Haftorah of the Ma'aseh Merkava. And the second day we read about Shavuos in Kol HaBachar. Now, Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah we read B'Chodesh Hashvi, which is also in Shorei Kesev. It's in Vayikra, so we read Shorei Kesev, and then for the maftir we say Haben Yaker Li Ephraim, which discusses the tshuva that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will hopefully accept, and we are inspiring ourselves to bring as well. That's in Sefer Yirmiyah. It refers to the tefillah of Rachel, that's Niskabel on Rosh Hashanah. Now, there are those who argue and say that we read V'Hashem and Pakad as Sarah, that Hashem remembered Sarah and made her pregnant, which took place on Rosh Hashanah. And for the maftir, we read when Chana became remembered and she was granted a child as well. That also happened on Rosh Hashanah. The Gemara says that today that we have 2 days, so we do both of those. And again, we switch the order. The first day we do Hashem and Pakad as Sarah and we do Chana. The second day we actually don't read from Kol B'char or from Shorei Kesev. The second day we read from the Maisa of the Akedah, the description of Akedas Yitzchak, and the Haftorah that we say there is Ha Ben Yaker Li, like we said about Rachel, whose voice was heard on high, and in her schus, that the redemption will arrive ultimately. Yom Kippur, says the Brisa, we read Parshas Acher Mos, the description of the Avodah, and the maftir is Kikaya Amar Ram Venisa. That is the haftarah for the first day. That is a haftarah for Shachris from Sefer Yeshaya. And by Mincha we read the Arayis, the Isurei Erva, to remind people who have Averis in their possession that they need to take care of it. And the haftarah that we say is Maftir Yonah, which of course discusses tshuva. Now, the haftarah for the Shachris reading talks about how to do a proper fast. It says Halozet Somev Chareyu, and that's why we read that there. Now, once we mention this pasuk of Kikay Omar Ram Venisa, so Rav Yochanan says a Joshua here. He says every time you find psukim speaking about the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it also speaks about his humility and how he helps out the poor and the downtrodden. And you find that in Torah, Nevi'im, and Iksuvim. So in Torah we find it Ki Hashem Elokeichem Hu Elokei Elokim V'Adonei Ha'Adonim. And right afterwards it says Osem Mishpat Yasam V'Almana. He is the God of the gods and the master of the masters, and he does justice for the orphan and for the widow. And now in Navi we find what we just mentioned, Kikamar Ram Venisa Sheikhen Ad V'Kadosh, high and exalted, dwelling in the heavens and holy. And right afterwards it says V'Azdaka V'Shval Ruach, that he's together with those who are depressed and downtrodden. And in Ksuvim we find where it says Aselu L'Rechav Ba'aravis B'Kol Shemai. And right after that it says Avi Yisomim V'Dayin Almanos, he's the father of the orphans and the one who gets justice for widows. Alright, now the Bryce moves on to discuss Sukkos. So it says the first day of Sukkos we read the Parshas Miados, that's in the Toras Kahanim, again that refers to Shor Kesev, which is in Emor. The Haftarah is Hine Yom Ba La Hashem. Hine Yom Ba La Hashem comes from the Navi Zechariah, and we read that then because it discusses Lochog Yitzchak HaSukkos, that they spoke about Sukkos there. Today we have 2 days of Sukkos, so for the second day we add the same thing, the same Kriya. And the Haftarah is Vayikalu El HaMelech Shlomo, that they gather together to inaugurate the Beis HaMikdash, which was a 7-day event which took place over Sukkot itself. Now, what do you read the rest of the days of Sukkot? So you read the Karbonos for each of the days. Rashi explains on the last daf that we read for each day, we start with the carbon for that day, and then we read the next day, and we read the third day, and then the fourth aliyah goes back and reads the first 2 days, which is how we do it today in Chutz La'aretz and Eretz Yisrael. They just read the same day 4 times. Okay, the Brisa continues, what do we lay on Shmini Atzeres? So there we lay in Kol B'char, but we start earlier, we start from Aser to Aser, because there are a number of mitzvahs that I mentioned there that are relevant to Sukkot's time. The Sukkot is a season. Rashi describes them all. It's a time of the ingathering of the crops. It's a time to leave for the poor people what we're supposed to leave for them. They should gather as well, so we speak about that. We speak about Meiser Ani, we speak about Nason Titain, Paseach Tiftach, Hanik Tanik, the freeing of the Eved Ivri, Havet Tavitenu, all these mitzvahs which apply to caring for the poor and for people who are slaves, and we lend them. All these things apply at this time, and therefore that's an appropriate kriya for Shmini Atzeres. The day of Shmini Atzeres has the Haftorah Vayhi Kechlos Shlomo, which is also part of, which also happened at Shmini Atzeres. It says at the end of the inauguration period, he sent them home. On the next day, the second day of Shmini Atzeres, which we call Simchas Torah, we read from V'zosa Bracha, and the Haftorah, the Gemara says, is from Vayamod Shlomo, to bless the which is in the same Kriya, it's in the same area in Malachim, continuation of what we read earlier. Now, what about Shabbos Chol Hamoed? So Rav Huna says in the name of Rav, Shabbos Chol Hamoed, both for Pesach and for Sukkot, we read from Kol B'char in Re'eh, and the Haftorah is different. On Pesach, the Haftorah is the Atomos Yeveshos, the dried up graveyard, the bones that dried from those who left Mitzrayim early, and at Sukkot we read about Milchemes Gog u'Magog, the war which is going to happen in advance of the coming of Mashiach, which is described in Sefer Zechariah. Now, Chanukah, we read about the Nesiim, how they each brought karbanos to inaugurate the Mizbeach. Chanukah is about re-inaugurating the Mizbeach. The Haftorah for Shabbos Chanukah, so we read about the description of the menorah in Zechariah. And if there are two Shabbosos on Chanukah, the first and the last day are both Shabbos, then the first one we read about the description of the menorah in Zechariah, and the second we read about the menorahs that were built by Shlomo. On Purim we read Vayavei Amalek, the attack of Amalek in the Parshas B'Shalach. Rosh Chodesh we read Rosh Chodshechem, the Haftorah, the Maftir, the Karbanos Musa for Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh, which is on Shabbos, and now we have a Haftorah that we add for Rosh Chodesh. We add V'Haya Midei Chodesh B'Chodshai, which is in Sefer Yeshaya, Parak Samach Vav, and when Rosh Chodesh falls out on a Sunday, so Shabbos is Erev Rosh Chodesh, then we read V'Yomer Lo Yehonasan Machar Chodesh, story of David fleeing with the help of Yehonasan, and the simon that they said, where he said Machar Chodesh, tomorrow is Rosh Chodesh, and they made up a plan based on that Rosh Chodesh feast that Shalom Melech was going to have. Okay, the Gemara goes further and talks about Rosh Chodesh Av and Tisha B'Av. So when Rosh Chodesh Av falls on the Shabbos, so there we have a Haftorah, Chodshechem u'mayadechem sana nafshi, your months, your Rosh Chodesh, and your Yom Tov are hated to me. Hashem says I didn't want it. Hayu alai l'toyrach, they were a strain for me, as it were, as if anything would be a strain for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What does it mean? Hayu alai l'toyrach, the Gemara explains, Hashem says, it's not enough that you do Averos, but you make me come up with ways to punish you. I have to dream up different Xeros to be gozer on you. The whole thing is a schlep for me. Now, Tisha B'Av, what do we read and what do we do the Haftorah? So, the Gemara doesn't discuss the Kriya right away. The Gemara discusses the Haftorah. Rav says it's Eicha Hosel Lezona. That is the Kriya that's in Sefer Yeshaya, Kirya Ne'amana. And what is the Kriya? So some say it's V'imlai Sishmuli, which is in Vayikra, the description of the beginning of the Tochacha. Rav Nassan Bar Yosef says it's from Adoni Yina Atzuni Ha'am Hazeh, that is read in Bamidbar by the Meraglim. Others say you read Admasi Leid Hara Azais also at the end of the Meraglim. Abayi says the minig is that we read Kisoylid Banim, which is in Devarim, and the bad things that will happen then. And the Haftarah is a Sof HaSifim, which is what we read today, which is in Yirmiyah, describing the ultimate Churban. Okay, the Gemara moves on to the Ma'amados. Ma'amados again were special kriyos that representatives of Klal Yisrael to stand by the Karbanos Tamid. So they used to read special things, that a whole special Seder Tefillah and Kriya. So what did they read? They read from Ma'aseh Bereshis. Gemara says, what's with that? Gemara says that's because the entire existence of the Ma'aseh Bereshis, the entire existence of the world, is built upon Karbanos. If not for Karbanos, it could not exist. Like the Torah says, and it says, so the creation of Shemayim and Aretz is dependent on the chukos, on the rules, on the laws, which specifically Karbanos. And now we have where HaKadosh Baruch Hu had a conversation with Avram, and he told him you're going to have children, and Avram said, how will I know? So the Gemara expounds on that conversation. The Gemara says that Avram said, maybe you're promising me that I'll have children, I'll have a Klal Yisrael, but maybe they'll do Averos and you'll destroy them. Maybe we'll destroy them like the Mabul and like the Aflaga. So he said, no, I'm not going to. They said, how am I going to know? So he said, take me a cut calf, egla, mishuleshes, vitar, vigozel. Those are referring to karbanos. So in the schus of karbanos, Klal Yisrael will always survive. So he said, Avram said that will work when the Beis Hamikdash is around. What about when there's no Beis Hamikdash? So he said, no, they will read the Seder Karbanos, and that'll count for me like the actual brought the Karbanos, and therefore for us, the Kriya. So when we represent Karbanos, when we have the Ma'amados, which is our participation in Karbanos, that'll keep Klal Yisrael around, and of course the entire world only exists in the merit of Klal Yisrael, and therefore you have to read Ma'aseh Bereishis, because Ma'aseh Bereishis is only in the merit ultimately of those Karbanos. Okay, now what about other fast days? So in our Mishnah we had said that you read the Brachos and the Klolos, you read from the Tochacha. So, and we also said that you don't interrupt in the Klolos, it's only one aliyah. You don't give two aliyahs for that. So Gemara says, what is the source for that? Halacha, the Gemara calls it Chia Bar Gamda, named Ravasi. It says, Musar Hashem b'ni al timas. Don't show that Hashem's musar is disgusting to you. Don't stop in the middle of it and say, I can't handle this. Rish Lakish says, because you don't want to say a bracha on bad things, you only say a bracha on good things, and therefore you can't have an aliyah start or end in the middle of the Klolos, and the bracha that you're saying will go on those Klolos. So what do? The Gemara says, well, you start at least one pasuk before the beginning of the Klolos, go all the way through the Klolos, and end at least one pasuk after the end of the Klolos. That way you're not saying any bracha on any Klolos specifically. Says Abaye, this is all true only for the Telchacha in Parshas Bechukosai, but the Telchacha in Kisavo, in Devarim, that you could stop in the middle of, and the reason is because they're very different. The one in Bechukosai is said by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's written in the first person voice of Hashem saying, I will do this, I will do this. The one in Kisavo is said by Moshe, and he's saying Hashem will do this, Hashem will do that. It's not Mipi Agvura, it's Moshe's words, and therefore you can break it up. It's not as severe as the other one. Now there was an incident where Levi Barbuti was reading the Tochacha and he was struggling to get through it, and he was in front of Rav Huna in Baruri. So Rav Huna said about you, they said you're allowed to stop in the middle of the Klolos of Parshas Kisavo, in the middle of that Tochacha. You're only not allowed to stop in the middle of Bechukosai since you're struggling to get through it, so you could stop. Okay, says the Gemara a Brisa. Shimon ben Elazar says Ezra was mataken for Klal Yisrael that they should read the Tochacha in Birchas in Bechukosai before Shavuos, and the Tochacha in Kisavo before Rosh Hashanah, in order that it should be just before the end of the year. And you could say the year should end along with its curses. We should start a new year free of these curses. Versus, well, I understand Kisavo is before Rosh Hashanah; that's the end of the year. But what is the Tochacha of Bechukosai before Shavuos? Shavuos is not Rosh Hashanah. Versus, yes, Shavuos is Rosh Hashanah because the judgment of Shavuos happens on the judgment of the fruits of the trees takes place on Chag HaBikurim on Shavuos, and therefore it is Rosh Hashanah le'ilanos to some extent. Okay, now the Gemara brings another unrelated Agadata Brisa of Rav Shimon ben Elazar, to the previous one. He says that if you have a disagreement between your advisors, the elderly, experienced ones tell you destroy something, and the younger ones tell you build, so you might think, well, it's always better to build than to destroy. He says, no, you should listen to the older ones, not to the younger ones, because when the older ones tell you destroy something, that is actually going to ultimately be a form of construction. You'll be building in the long run. It's time to take it down. It's time to take it down and start over. When the young ones tell you to build, that's just going to end up being destructive in the long run. How should you remember? Rechavam, son of Shlomo, did not listen to the advice of the sages, the older ones. He instead listened to the advice of his young friends, and he laid heavy taxes on the people and ended up with a rebellion on his hands, which ripped the kingdom in half for the rest of all time thus far. Okay, now we have a brisa which discusses how the Kriyas Torah of Shabbos Mincha, Monday, and Thursday work. So we have a machlokas. The first opinion says there is no overlap between any of the kriyos during a regular week. Wherever you finish the parsha on Shabbos Shachris, that's where you pick up reading for Shabbos Mincha. Wherever you finish reading Shabbos Mincha, that's where you pick up for Monday. If you finish Monday, that's where you pick up for Thursday. And if you finish Thursday, that's where you pick up the next Kriya by Shabbos Shachris. Now, that's Rabbi Meir's opinion. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he says, no, there is no picking up where you left off. You have the parsha of the week. You read the entire parsha of the week on Shabbos Shachris, read a specific part of it, the first aliyah of it, for Shabbos Mincha, Monday and Thursday, but that does not take away from what you read by Shabbos Shachris. You have to go back to the beginning of the parsha, Shabbos Shachris. Now, Rabbi Zera lists the halacha, and he says that that's how he spells out. He says wherever you stop by Shabbos Shachris, that's what you pick up by Mincha, and you repeat it Monday, Thursday, and the next Shabbos. Someone says, why don't you just say the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda? My answer is because he had the name switched, and therefore he didn't want to say like any specific name because there's some discussion about the name, and therefore he just said that what the actual halacha is.